Nathaniel Callahan thought he had it all, a thriving career, a beautiful home, and a loving marriage. But when his wife Jessica's frequent work trips and late-night secrets unravel into a devastating affair, Nathaniel's world shatters. Consumed by betrayal, he meticulously plans his revenge, severing the ties that once bound them. Just as he begins to rebuild his life, tragedy strikes. Jessica, weighed down by guilt and regret, makes a shocking and irreversible decision, leaving Nathaniel to grapple with the haunting legacy of their broken love. A gripping tale of trust, betrayal, and the unforeseen cost of revenge, this story delves deep into the complexities of marriage and the devastating ripple effects of infidelity. How far would you go to reclaim your dignity, and what would it cost you in the end? The morning light filtered through the blinds, soft and warm, a sharp contrast to the cold knot in my stomach. Jessica was in the kitchen, humming as she poured coffee into her favorite floral mug. Her laughter echoed faintly as she scrolled through her phone. She looked perfect, untouchable, as if the past year of strange behavior and late-night work meetings hadn't happened. But something felt different that day, off, wrong. I watched her from the doorway, her ease, her rhythm. A part of me wanted to believe that everything was as it seemed. After all, we had built this life together. I still clung to the memories of our early days, our weekend hikes, the late-night conversations that stretched until dawn, and the way her hand fit perfectly into mine. But those memories were eclipsed by the nagging doubts that had begun to fester. It wasn't just the sudden influx of work trips or the way she guarded her phone like a state secret. It was the distance in her eyes when she kissed me goodbye, the stilted conversations that felt more like obligations than connections. That morning, she kissed me lightly on the cheek and grabbed her briefcase. "Don't wait up," she said, her voice breezy. "It's going to be a long one." I nodded, masking my unease. "Be safe." The door clicked shut behind her, and the house fell into silence. I stared at the untouched coffee she'd left on the counter. My thoughts churned. I didn't want to be that husband, the paranoid one who doubted his wife's every move. But something about her words, her tone, her casual dismissal of me, screamed that she wasn't just heading to the office. My phone buzzed on the counter, jolting me from my thoughts. A reminder from my calendar, lunch with Eric at noon. I sighed. Maybe I just needed to clear my head. Eric, my closest friend since college, always had a way of putting things into perspective. The cafe was bustling when I arrived. Eric was already seated, his laptop open as he tapped away. He looked up and grinned when he saw me. "Running late," he teased, closing the screen. "Yeah, sorry," I muttered, sliding into the chair across from him. Eric's grin faltered. "You okay, Nate? You look like you've been chewing on nails." I hesitated, then leaned in. "Something's going on with Jessica." Eric raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "She's been acting strange. More distant. Always on her phone. And these work trips, there are just so many of them now." Eric frowned, his gaze sharpening. "Have you talked to her about it?" "I've tried, but she brushes it off. Says I'm imagining things." I paused. "But it doesn't feel right, Eric. I can't shake the feeling that she's hiding something." He leaned back, studying me. "Listen, man, you know I love Jess. But if your gut's telling you something's wrong, it's worth looking into." I nodded, the words settling uncomfortably in my chest. Eric's support was reassuring, but it also felt like validation of my worst fears. That evening, the house was quiet when Jessica returned. She moved through the space like a ghost, avoiding my eyes as she hung her coat and headed upstairs. I watched her, the doubts swirling in my mind. After she fell asleep, her phone sat on the nightstand, its screen dark. My heart pounded as I reached for it. This wasn't me. This wasn't the kind of husband I wanted to be. But the need to know outweighed my guilt. Her phone was locked. Of course, it was. I cursed under my breath, placing it back exactly as I'd found it. I would have to try another way. The next morning, while she showered, I grabbed her laptop from the study. Her password was the same as it had always been. Relief flooded me as I logged in, but it was short-lived. Her inbox was pristine, devoid of any personal messages or incriminating evidence. Just as I was about to give up, a notification popped up, calendar reminder, weekend at the Crescent Hotel, Mark. My stomach dropped. Mark. The name had come up in passing, just a colleague, she'd said. Nothing to worry about. But now his name loomed large, a shadow over our marriage. Jessica's footsteps sounded on the stairs, and I barely had time to shut the laptop before she entered the room. She smiled, unaware of my racing heart. Heading out early today, she said, grabbing her keys. I nodded, my mind already racing with plans. If I wanted answers, I would need to act quickly. Later that afternoon, I made a decision. I called a private investigator. His voice was calm, professional, as he asked for details. I told him everything, the trips, the secrecy, the name. Mark. We'll find out what's going on, he assured me. These things are rarely as complicated as they seem. I hung up, a strange mix of relief and dread settling over me. I had crossed a line, one I couldn't uncross. But the seeds of doubt had already taken root, and I couldn't stop until I knew the truth. Days passed in a blur of routine and tension. Jessica remained oblivious, her demeanor unchanged. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Every time she left the house, I wondered if it was the last time I'd see her the way I once knew her. Then, one evening, the investigator called. Nathaniel, we need to meet. I have information you'll want to see. My hands trembled as I ended the call. The moment of truth had arrived. Everything I thought I knew about my wife, my marriage, was about to be tested. I wasn't sure I was ready for what lay ahead, but there was no turning back now. The diner was nearly empty when I arrived, save for a few patrons nursing their coffees in solitude. I spotted the investigator, a man named Daniel Ward, sitting in a corner booth. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm, as if he had delivered news like this 1,000 times before. He waved me over with a professional detachment that only made my anxiety worse. I slid into the seat across from him, trying to mask the turmoil churning inside me. What do you have? I asked, cutting straight to the point. Daniel set a slim manila envelope on the table. I've gathered enough to confirm your suspicions, he said, his tone measured. Inside are photographs, records, and a summary of my findings. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the envelope. The weight of what might lie within felt unbearable. But I couldn't leave it unopened. Slowly, I flipped it open and pulled out the contents. The first photograph was grainy but unmistakable, Jessica, walking hand in hand with Mark outside a hotel. My breath hitched. The next image showed them laughing over a candlelit dinner, their faces illuminated by soft golden light. And then, the final blow, a photo of them embracing outside her car. My chest tightened. It wasn't just the physical closeness that stung, it was the ease, the familiarity, as if this was their normal. I closed my eyes, the images searing into my mind. They've been meeting regularly, Daniel said, breaking the silence. Primarily at hotels in the area, but occasionally out of town. I also traced financial records that suggest she's been covering her tracks, using cash and prepaid cards for certain expenses. How long? I croaked, my throat dry. From what I can tell, at least 8 months, he replied. 8 months. Nearly a year of deceit. I clenched my fists, trying to suppress the anger rising within me. Daniel slid another piece of paper across the table. This is my report, including a timeline of their meetings. I've also included the contact information of a divorce attorney if you decide to go that route. I nodded, unable to muster a response. My thoughts were a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and a desperate need for answers. Back home, the house was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I sat at the kitchen table, the photographs spread out before me. Jessica's face stared back at me, smiling, radiant, and utterly unrecognizable. This wasn't the woman I thought I knew. The front door opened, and Jessica walked in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She was holding a bag of groceries, her face lighting up when she saw me. "You're home early," she said, setting the bag on the counter. "Everything okay?" I stared at her, unable to reconcile the image before me with the one in the photos. "Yeah," I said, my voice strained. "Just felt like calling it a day." She nodded, seemingly unbothered, and began unpacking the groceries. I watched her every movement, the way she hummed under her breath, the way her hair fell across her face. It all felt like a lie. "Jessica," I said suddenly, my voice sharper than I intended. She paused, turning to me. "Yes. Do you ever think about us? About our life together?" Her brow furrowed. "Of course I do. Why would you even ask that?" I hesitated, unsure how far to push. "I don't know. Sometimes it feels like you're distant." She laughed lightly, waving a hand. "That's just work stress. You know how it is." I nodded, pretending to accept her excuse. But inside, the weight of what I knew threatened to crush me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Jessica lay beside me, her breathing steady and even. I stared at the ceiling, the questions racing through my mind. How had it come to this? Was I not enough for her? Or was it something else entirely? I slipped out of bed and headed to the living room, needing space to think. The envelope sat on the coffee table, a grim reminder of the truth I had uncovered. I flipped through the photos again, studying every detail, as if they held answers I hadn't yet found. By dawn, I had made up my mind. Confronting her wouldn't be enough. I needed to protect myself, to ensure that her betrayal didn't destroy everything I had built. The next step was clear: I needed a lawyer. The office was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Jennifer Pratt, the attorney recommended by Daniel, sat across from me, her presence commanding yet approachable. "Infidelity cases are never easy," she began, her tone professional. "But based on the evidence you've provided, you're in a strong position." I nodded, though the words brought little comfort. "What do I need to do?" She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. "First, we'll need to gather financial records, joint assets, and any additional proof of her infidelity. You'll also need to decide if you want to pursue an at-fault divorce, which could affect alimony and asset division." I listened carefully, the gravity of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just about ending my marriage, it was about untangling a life we had spent years building together. Jennifer's gaze softened. "I know this is overwhelming, Nathaniel. But you're doing the right thing. Protecting yourself is the first step toward moving forward." I nodded, grateful for her reassurance. "What about Jessica? She doesn't know I'm doing this." Jennifer's expression hardened. "It's better that way. The element of surprise can work in your favor, especially if she tries to hide assets or manipulate the situation." As I left her office, the weight on my chest felt a little lighter. I had a plan, a way forward. But the hardest part was yet to come, telling Jessica that I knew everything. The decision to confront Jessica wasn't easy. I spent days rehearsing the conversation in my head, cycling through anger, sorrow, and a faint, stubborn hope that there was some explanation, no matter how unlikely. But with each passing day, her betrayal became more unbearable, the weight of it pressing on my chest like a leaden anchor. The breaking point came on a Friday evening. Jessica had been gone all day, her absence a void in our home that I couldn't ignore. When she finally returned, the air between us was taut with unspoken tension. She moved through the house, humming softly, oblivious to the storm brewing within me. "Jess," I called from the living room, my voice sharper than I intended. She paused in the hallway, her head tilting slightly. "Yeah. Can you come here? We need to talk." Her hesitation was brief but telling. She set her purse down on the console table and stepped into the room. "What's this about?" she asked, her tone light, but her posture stiff. I gestured to the couch. "Sit." Jessica's eyes narrowed, a flicker of apprehension crossing her face. She sat, smoothing her skirt, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "You're being dramatic," she said with a strained laugh. "What's going on?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words lodged in my throat, choked by 1,000 emotions clamoring for release. Finally, I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and met her gaze. "I know," I said simply. Her smile faltered. "Know what?" "About you and Mark," I said, my voice steady, even as my heart pounded. Jessica's face drained of color, her carefully composed mask cracking. She opened her mouth, then closed it, searching for words that wouldn't come. I don't know what you're talking about." I reached for the manila envelope on the coffee table and slid it toward her. "Don't insult me, Jess. It's all here. The photos, the timeline, everything." Her hands trembled as she took the envelope, her breath shallow and rapid. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the contents. With every photograph, her shoulders slumped further, the weight of her deceit crushing her. "I can explain," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Can you?" I asked, my tone icy. "Go ahead, Jessica. Explain how you could betray me for nearly a year. Explain how you smiled at me every day, kissed me goodnight, and then went to him." Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, her voice breaking. "It started as nothing. Just harmless flirting. But then—" "Stop," I cut her off, raising a hand. "I don't want to hear the details. I don't care how it started or what excuses you have. You made a choice, Jess. Over and over again, you chose him." Her tears spilled over, streaking her cheeks. "I was lonely," she said, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "You've been so busy, so distant. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore." I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. "So your solution was to cheat? To throw away everything we built because you felt neglected?" Jessica reached for me, her fingers brushing my arm. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I love you, Nathaniel. I never stopped loving you." I pulled away, her touch like fire against my skin. "Love? You call this love? Don't kid yourself." Silence fell between us, heavy and oppressive. Jessica stared at me, her expression pleading, but I had no comfort to offer her. The betrayal was too deep, the wound too raw. "I've spoken to a lawyer," I said finally, my voice hard. "I'm filing for divorce." Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. "No," she said, shaking her head. "Nathaniel, please. We can fix this. I'll do anything. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. Just don't end us." "It's already over," I said coldly. "You ended it the moment you chose him." Jessica's sobs filled the room, but I felt no satisfaction, no vindication. Just an empty, aching void where my love for her had once been. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork and tense conversations. Jessica tried everything to change my mind, apologies, promises, even anger. But my resolve was unshakable. I had given her my trust, my heart, and she had shattered both. One evening, As I packed a box of my belongings, she appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Do you really hate me that much?" she asked softly. I set the box down and looked at her, my expression weary. "I don't hate you, Jess. I wish I could, but I don't. I'm just done. I can't keep living this lie." Her lip trembled, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But she simply nodded, her shoulders sagging in defeat. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." I nodded, unable to muster a response. Sorry wasn't enough. It never would be. The day I moved out was quiet, almost surreal. Jessica watched from the porch as I loaded the last of my things into the car. She didn't cry, didn't plead. She just stood there, a ghost of the woman I had once loved. As I drove away, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The chapter of my life with Jessica was over, but a new one was just beginning. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I knew one thing for sure: I would never let myself be betrayed like this again. The weeks following my departure were a haze of adjustments and new routines. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, its bare walls a reflection of my hollowed-out spirit. Work consumed my days, while sleepless nights were spent staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the ghost of my marriage. Jessica and I communicated only through lawyers. Her messages, once filled with desperate pleas and apologies, had grown terse and procedural. It seemed we both understood there was no room left for reconciliation, only resolution. Then came the call. It was a Thursday evening, and I had just settled in with a beer, the TV flickering in the background. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. The caller ID displayed a number I didn't recognize. "Hello? Mr. Callahan?" The voice was calm, professional. "This is Officer Miller with the City Police Department. I'm afraid I have some difficult news." My stomach dropped, the air around me suddenly too thick to breathe. "What's happened?" "It's about your wife, Jessica Callahan." I froze. Though we were in the midst of divorce proceedings, hearing her name in this context sent a chill through me. "Ex-wife," I corrected automatically. "What about her?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, one that seemed to stretch forever. "She was found earlier this evening in her car at Red Rock Overlook. It appears she took her own life." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I gripped the edge of the couch, my knuckles white. "What?" I whispered, the word barely audible. "She left a note addressed to you," the officer continued gently. "I'm very sorry for your loss." The next few days passed in a fog. I attended to the formalities, speaking with the authorities, arranging for her belongings to be collected, and preparing myself to read the note she'd left behind. It sat on my kitchen table for 3 days, untouched, the weight of it unbearable. When I finally opened it, her familiar handwriting greeted me, shaky and uneven. "Nathaniel. I don't know where to begin, except to say that I'm sorry. Sorry for everything I did to you, for the pain I caused, for the betrayal that broke us apart. I don't expect forgiveness, I know I don't deserve it. You were my anchor, my steady force, and I threw it all away for something fleeting, something that wasn't real. I thought I could find excitement, fulfillment, but all I found was emptiness. The things I did with Mark, they were never about love. They were about my own fears, my own insecurities. And now I see what I lost because of them. I've been haunted by the weight of my choices, by the life we could have had if I'd only been braver, better. The guilt is unbearable, and the thought of continuing on without you is too much. I know this doesn't fix anything, and it won't bring you peace, but I needed you to know that you were everything to me. Please take care of yourself. Find happiness again. You deserve it. Jessica." The words blurred as tears welled in my eyes. Her pain, her regret, it was all there, laid bare in ink. I felt an ache deep in my chest, a mix of sorrow, anger, and guilt. She had made her choices, yes, but had I pushed her too far? Could I have handled things differently, softened the blows instead of letting my anger take the wheel? I carried the note with me to her funeral, held at a small chapel outside the city. It was a somber, muted affair, attended by only a handful of friends and family. As the pastor spoke of redemption and forgiveness, I felt a pang of bitterness. Was there redemption for us? For her? For me? At the graveside, I stood alone as the others departed. The air was heavy with the scent of freshly turned earth, the sky a dull gray. I clutched the note in my hand, unsure of what to say to the woman I had once loved, the woman who had shattered me and, in the end, shattered herself. "I'm sorry too," I murmured, my voice breaking. I wish things had been different." The wind carried my words away, leaving only the silence of the cemetery. I placed the note on her grave and turned to leave, the weight of her absence pressing down on me. Life moved forward, as it always does, but the tragedy of Jessica's death lingered. It became a shadow, a reminder of the fragility of love and the cost of betrayal. Though I tried to rebuild, to move on, a part of me remained tethered to the past, to the life we had shared and the pain that had torn it apart. In the end, there was no clean resolution, no neat conclusion to our story. Just two broken hearts, each carrying the weight of what might have been.